The day I became the most hated man in Willow Spring Estates was the same day I became its most powerful, $350,000. That's what Veronica Ashford and her Homeowners Association fined me for maintaining my late wife's memorial garden. The same place where she used to teach neighborhood kids about farming. What they didn't know was that I had 340 acres and 33 years of property rights to fight back with every deed, survey, and bankruptcy document. If you are watching this video on your phone in the bathroom to escape those mind-numbing HOA meetings, drop a comment right now telling me where you're hiding. I guarantee this story will keep you glued to your screen. Let me back up and tell you how this nightmare started. My name is Clayton Brewster, and I was 58 years old when this all began. I had lived on that land for as long as I could remember, and in truth, longer than I ever realized at the time. My grandfather bought those 340 acres back in 1952, when the county still smelled of fresh hay and dirt roads ran where asphalt now gleams. He raised cattle there, grew corn in long, straight rows, and built the stone farmhouse that still stands today. That house has weathered more winters than most people I know, and every wall holds the weight of generations. When Sarah and I married 35 years ago, we moved into that old homestead together. She was a school teacher by trade, but her heart belonged to the land. The first thing she did was choose a small patch of soil behind the house and kneel down in the dirt like she was greeting an old friend. That patch would become her garden. Tomatoes, peppers, beans, herbs, all heirloom varieties passed down from her mother and grandmother. She tended those plants with patience and care, teaching our children and later our grandchildren how food didn't come from a store shelf, but from the earth and from effort. When Sarah got sick, that garden became more than a hobby. It became her refuge. Even during chemotherapy, when walking across the yard took everything she had, she would insist on going outside. I would watch her lean on her cane, pulling weeds one by one, her face peaceful in a way the hospital never gave her. 2 years ago, when she passed, I promised myself that garden would never disappear. It wasn't just soil and plants, it was her memory. For decades, nothing disturbed our quiet life. In the early 1990s, developers bought up the surrounding farmland and built what they called Willow Spring Estates. 127 homes appeared almost overnight, each with identical mailboxes, carefully trimmed lawns, and streets named after trees that had been cut down to make room for them. They formed an HOA in 1995. I attended exactly one meeting, realized it had nothing to do with me, and went back to my life. For 27 years, there were no problems, no complaints, no letters, no fines. I waved politely when neighbors drove by. Some even brought their children over to help Sarah in the garden. Then Veronica Ashford arrived. Veronica was 45 years old and carried herself like she'd been appointed to rule wherever she stood. She drove a silver Lexus that never had a speck of dust on it and wore pearl earrings even when inspecting trash cans. She had moved in from a large coastal city and made no secret of her belief that Willow Spring Estates needed modernization. Within a year, she ran for HOA president and won. Her speeches were polished. She spoke of protecting property values and preserving community aesthetics. To longtime residents, those words sounded harmless, but to me, they felt like warning bells. The first notice came in early spring. It was slipped into my mailbox in a white envelope, with the HOA logo stamped in blue. Agricultural use in a residential zone, it read. A $2,500 fine for Sarah's garden. I stood there holding the paper, reading it twice, then a third time, convinced it had to be a mistake. I called the HOA office. Veronica answered personally. "That garden is not compliant," she said calmly, as if discussing the weather. "Vegetable cultivation violates residential appearance standards." I explained what the garden meant. I told her about Sarah. There was a pause on the line, just long enough for me to hope she might understand. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said flatly, "but rules are rules." That was only the beginning. The next citation targeted the fence. The same stone and wire boundary my grandfather built in 1952 was suddenly labeled a non-conforming boundary marker. Each notice arrived like a blow to the chest. It wasn't just money. It was the sense that someone was deliberately dismantling the life we had built, piece by piece. Veronica wasn't correcting violations. She was erasing history. Then she brought in Marcus. Marcus was her brother-in-law, a city inspector with just enough authority to make trouble and just enough family loyalty to use it. He arrived one morning in a city truck, clipboard in hand, and walked my land as if he owned it. For 2 hours, they circled my property, inventing violations as they went. My gravel driveway, the same one 4 generations of Brewsters had used, suddenly required modern paving standards. $85,000. The stone chimney, which had stood since Eisenhower was president, was deemed structurally non-compliant. $45,000. Even the old oak tree where Sarah hung bird feeders was cited for hazardous overhang. By the time they left, the total had climbed past $180,000. I stopped sleeping. Every morning I dreaded walking down the driveway, fearing another envelope waiting in the mailbox. The fines began accruing daily penalties. My insurance company threatened cancellation. The bank sent letters. I sold Sarah's antique furniture to pay the first round of fines, watching pieces of our shared life disappear to satisfy a woman who had never set foot on this land before deciding it offended her. Friends told me to give in. "Just tear out the garden," they said. "It's not worth it," but they didn't understand. This wasn't about plants. It was about dignity, about memory, about whether a man could still stand his ground after losing the person who gave his life meaning. Then, one morning, the Lexus returned. Veronica stood at the edge of Sarah's garden with her silver ruler, measuring fence posts. Marcus walked behind her, scribbling notes. When I asked under what authority they were conducting another inspection, Marcus pointed to my driveway and began listing violations, as if reciting a grocery list. That was the moment something changed inside me. As I sat on the porch afterward, holding a stack of citations thick enough to choke a horse, I realized something important. Veronica believed I was helpless, a widower, an aging man clinging to the past. She assumed I would fold. She was wrong. The next morning I drove to the county courthouse. The basement records room smelled of dust and old paper. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. I began pulling deeds, surveys, anything related to my grandfather's land. Years as a hydrogeologist had taught me one thing. Property law is rarely simple, and people who think they understand it often don't. That's when I found it. The original 1987 agreement between my grandfather and Clearwater Development wasn't a sale. It was a development rights lease. My grandfather had sold the right to build houses, not the land itself. The realization hit me like a thunderclap. If that was true, then the HOA's authority rested on shaky ground, very shaky ground. When I asked the county clerk for supporting documents, she avoided my eyes. Records missing, files misfiled, excuses stacked higher than the shelves. But persistence has always been my strength. After 3 days of digging, I found a carbon copy of the contract tucked away in a mislabeled box. Land ownership retained by Brewster family. For the first time in months, I felt something other than exhaustion. I felt resolve. But Veronica wasn't done. 3 weeks later, a foreclosure notice arrived. 30 days to vacate. That night I called my daughter Jessica. She listened in silence as I read the letter aloud. Then she spoke carefully. "Dad," she said, "this doesn't sound legal." She booked a flight home the same day. As I hung up the phone, staring at the foreclosure notice spread across the kitchen table, one thought echoed in my mind. This wasn't just a dispute anymore. This was a fight. And neither side was backing down. The days after the foreclosure notice blurred together in a way I can only describe as suffocating. Every sound felt louder. Every knock at the door made my chest tighten. I slept lightly, waking at odd hours, convinced I had heard footsteps outside. And each morning, before the sun fully rose, I walked out to Sarah's garden and stood there, grounding myself in the quiet. The soil still smelled the same. The birds still came. But something darker hovered over everything now. Jessica arrived on a late-night flight, exhausted but focused. She hugged me tightly in the driveway, then immediately asked to see every document I had collected. We spread them across the kitchen table: violation notices, foreclosure letters, property maps, old surveys, handwritten notes from the courthouse. She read slowly, carefully, her brow tightening with every page. "Dad," she said finally, "this is worse than harassment. This is coordinated." She explained it calmly, the way lawyers do when delivering bad news. The HOA wasn't just fining me. They were trying to break me financially before I could fight back. Daily penalties, insurance threats, foreclosure pressure, all designed to force a quick surrender. And the timing wasn't accidental. Someone knew the old records mattered. Someone wanted them buried. But then something happened that neither of us expected. Jessica noticed a small inconsistency in one of the HOA filings. A reference number didn't match the county's standard format. It was minor, the kind of thing most people would ignore, but it suggested the document hadn't to come directly from county archives. It had been recreated. "That means," she said slowly, "someone already knows the originals are a problem." The next morning we returned to the courthouse. The clerk on duty that day, Nancy, greeted us with forced politeness. When Jessica requested certified copies of the 1987 Clearwater development documents, Nancy hesitated. Too long. Her eyes flicked toward the hallway behind her. "I'm afraid those records aren't available," she said. "Some files from the late 80s were damaged." "Damaged how?" Jessica asked evenly. "A water leak," Nancy replied quickly. That answer didn't sit right. Courthouses log everything. Leaks, repairs, insurance claims. Jessica asked for the maintenance report. Nancy said she'd need approval. As we left the building, Jessica stopped in the parking lot and looked back at the courthouse. "Dad," she said quietly, "someone's scared." Over the next week, the pressure intensified. The HOA sent a second foreclosure letter, then a third. Veronica's tone changed from formal to openly threatening. One notice warned of criminal trespassing charges if I remained on the property after the deadline. The irony of being accused of trespassing on land my family had owned for decades would have been laughable if it weren't terrifying. Neighbors stopped waving. Some avoided eye contact altogether. Others whispered when I passed. Veronica had begun spreading her version of the story, that I was a bitter old man trying to extort the community, that my documents were forged, that property values were at risk. Fear works fast when people believe their homes are threatened. Then came the inspectors again. This time they didn't knock. I returned from the feed store one afternoon to find fresh tire tracks near the garden. The gate stood open. My heart pounded as I walked closer. 3 of Sarah's tomato plants had been pulled from the ground and tossed aside like trash. Jessica stared at it in disbelief. "They trespassed to create a violation," she said. "We installed security cameras that night." But even as the harassment escalated, the truth was beginning to surface elsewhere. Jessica contacted Eleanor Patterson, a 73-year-old genealogical researcher known for tracking down lost property records. Eleanor had worked with families fighting boundary disputes for decades and knew where paperwork tended to vanish and where copies survived. Eleanor met us at her small home office 2 days later, surrounded by filing cabinets and the faint smell of old books. She listened carefully, nodding as Jessica explained the situation. Clearwater Development, Eleanor said thoughtfully. That name hasn't come up in years. She charged us a modest fee and promised a full property history. 2 days after that, she called. "You need to sit down," she said. Eleanor had found the original survey maps from 1987. According to them, my grandfather's 340 acres included the entire footprint of Willow Spring Estates. Every street, every house, every common area. The implications were staggering. But then something happened that raised the stakes even higher. Eleanor tracked down the original surveyor, Tom Bradley, now retired. Over coffee at a diner, he confirmed what the maps suggested. Clearwater never owned the land outright. They leased development rights. When the company went bankrupt in 1991, something almost no one remembered, the incomplete transfer should have reverted ownership back to the Brewster family. That meant Willow Spring Estates had been built on land that legally belonged to us for more than 30 years. Jessica's hands shook as she took notes. "Dad," she said, "this isn't just an HOA issue. This is massive title fraud." Meanwhile, Veronica's lawyers escalated. Peton and Associates filed a countersuit for $2.3 million, claiming adverse possession. They argued the residents had gained ownership through continuous use. It was a bold move, and a desperate one. You can't claim adverse possession while simultaneously insisting you already own the land. They were contradicting themselves, and they knew it. That evening, as I sat alone in Sarah's garden, reading through the lawsuit, a realization settled in. Veronica wasn't just trying to win. She was trying to outrun the truth before it caught up to her. Jessica made another call, this time to a retired bankruptcy attorney in Florida named Richard Sterling, Clearwater's former lawyer. What he told us changed everything. Clearwater never completed payment to my grandfather. When they filed for Chapter 11, ownership should have snapped back to us under federal bankruptcy law. Sterling still had the paperwork. He had tried to reach my family decades earlier. Letters that never arrived. They sold land they didn't own, he said, and everyone built on it. As if on cue, the fines reached $350,000. Veronica issued one final citation, this time accusing me of criminal trespass during foreclosure proceedings. She gave me 24 hours to vacate. Jessica read it and smiled grimly. She just crossed a line she can't uncross. That night, I barely slept. Outside, the neighborhood hummed quietly. Families watched television, kids did homework. Everyone unaware that the ground beneath their homes was about to become the center of a courtroom battle that would decide everything. The truth was no longer hidden. It was coming, fast. And when it arrived, no one would be able to pretend this was just about a garden anymore. By the time the sun rose the next morning, it felt as though there was no air left in the house. Everything had narrowed to a single point in time. Either the truth came out now, or it never would. Veronica S.'s final notice sat on the kitchen counter like a loaded weapon. 24 hours to vacate or face arrest for trespassing. On paper, it sounded official. In reality, it was reckless. And recklessness is usually what people turn to when they know they're losing control. Jessica spent the morning on the phone, not arguing, not negotiating, documenting. Every call was logged, every voicemail saved, every email printed. She explained that in court, tone matters less than patterns, and Veronica's pattern had become clear: intimidation, escalation, and abuse of authority. But then something happened that neither of us expected. At 10:17 a.m., a city vehicle pulled into the driveway again. Not Marcus this time, two unfamiliar inspectors. They didn't announce themselves. They walked straight toward the well house with measuring tools already in hand. The cameras caught everything. Jessica stepped outside and calmly asked them to leave. They refused, citing Emergency Enforcement Authority. That phrase alone told her exactly what Veronica was attempting. Emergency authority allows limited entry only when there's an imminent danger to public safety. A locked tool shed on private land does not qualify. Jessica informed them they were trespassing and that law enforcement was being contacted. One inspector hesitated, the other kept measuring. That hesitation was important. People hesitate when they realize they've been lied to. When the sheriff arrived, the inspectors suddenly couldn't produce valid authorization paperwork. They left quietly, avoiding eye contact. That incident alone would later become a key moment in court, proof that Veronica was misusing municipal channels to harass a private landowner. By noon, Eleanor Patterson arrived with a leather satchel full of documents. She spread them across the table slowly, reverently, as though handling family photographs. "Your grandfather was very careful," she said, "more careful than anyone realized." At the center was the original 1987 contract, not a copy, but a preserved original from a bank safety deposit box that had changed ownership 3 times since. It clearly stated 99-year development rights lease. Land ownership retained by Brewster family in perpetuity. Attached was a handwritten letter from my grandfather explaining why he structured it that way. He didn't trust developers. He wanted protection if things went wrong. And things had gone wrong. Eleanor had also uncovered Clearwater's bankruptcy filings. The final payment had never been made. Under federal law, the land reverted automatically. No exceptions, no loopholes. Jessica leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly. "This isn't just strong," she said, "it's devastating." But we still needed certified records, originals, and that's when the situation turned dark. That evening, while driving past the courthouse, I noticed something odd. Lights on in the records basement after hours. A familiar silver Lexus parked nearby. I stopped. From across the street, I watched Veronica exit the courthouse with Nancy, the clerk. Their body language was tense, close, urgent. Then I saw the envelope. Cash. I started recording. 20 minutes later, Nancy carried a box labeled Property Records 1980-1989 out to her car. I followed at a distance, heart pounding, until she pulled into the municipal incineration facility. She threw the box into the fire. 30 years of history, gone. The next morning, we returned to the courthouse. Nancy couldn't meet our eyes. "I'm sorry," she said. "Those records were destroyed in a water incident." Jessica placed my phone on the counter and pressed play. Nancy collapsed into tears. What followed wasn't anger. It was fear. She confessed everything. The bribe, the instructions, the pressure Veronica applied when Eleanor's research started getting too close. She signed a statement in exchange for cooperation with state investigators. But Veronica had underestimated something. While she was destroying county records, Richard Sterling's originals were already en route from Florida, and more importantly, Sterling had filed copies with the State Land Commission decades earlier, records that were untouchable by local corruption. By the afternoon, state investigators were involved, and yet Veronica made one last move. She issued a final citation. The community center was packed by 7 o'clock that Sunday evening. Every seat filled, families standing along the walls, the hum of whispered speculation vibrating through the air. Many residents had never seen a special assessment of this magnitude, $25,000 per household, and the anxiety was palpable. They had no idea the meeting would become the theater for a revelation that would redefine their entire lives. I arrived with Jessica, Eleanor Patterson, and our attorney, carrying boxes of survey equipment, legal files, and certified copies of property documents. Tom Bradley, the original surveyor, was beside me, prepared to lay out 35-year-old maps that traced every corner of my grandfather's land. Lisa Chang, investigative reporter from Channel 7, set up cameras in the back of the room to broadcast live. Veronica Ashford, navy blazer perfectly pressed, pearls glinting under fluorescent lights, called the meeting to order with her usual air of control. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "we face an unprecedented legal challenge." Her voice was firm, practiced. "A frivolous lawsuit threatens the very foundation of our community. Your homes, your investments, everything you've worked for, endangered by one disgruntled neighbor." Her words drew murmurs, some nods. Fear is persuasive when wielded with authority. But then she made a mistake. "I have been aware," she admitted, "of questions regarding property ownership for some time." Her eyes darted toward the back of the room. She faltered. "I've consulted attorneys. I've reviewed documents." Her admission hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Jessica stood calmly. "Mrs. Ashford, if you've known these issues for months, why did you continue issuing fines and threatening foreclosure? And why did you establish a company to collect the $3 million from residents under the guise of legal defense?" The room erupted in murmurs. Phones were pulled out. Screens illuminated faces, showing evidence of the shell company registration, financial trails, and state business filings. Veronica's composure faltered. She opened her mouth, but no words emerged. Panic flickered in her eyes. Then Tom Bradley stepped forward. He set up a small projector and displayed the original 1987 survey maps. Every street, every lot, every common area. He pointed to the boundary lines with deliberate precision. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said in his steady, authoritative voice, "you have been living on someone else's property for 33 years. A hush fell over the room. Confusion, disbelief. Then a ripple of murmurs, questions and whispers. I walked to the front, carrying 127 envelopes, one for each household. "I am Clayton Brewster," I said. My voice carried across the room, firm but calm. "I own the land your homes are built on." I handed the envelopes row by row, each family receiving a copy of my grandfather's original contract, certified deeds, and a clear explanation of their options. Either purchase their lot at the original 1987 price, or enter a monthly lease agreement at $850 per month. The crowd's reactions were immediate: shock, relief, anger, confusion, a swirl of raw human emotion. Jessica stepped forward, holding documents that revealed Veronica's misconduct: bribery, embezzlement, harassment under color of authority. The residents listened in stunned silence as every detail unfolded, verified by sworn affidavits, video evidence, and certified originals. Eleanor Patterson presented the final pieces. She traced the fraudulent transfers, explained the bankruptcy reversion, and showed that the Brewster family had legally retained ownership of the land from 1991 onward. Every legal loophole Veronica had tried to exploit was countered with hard evidence. The truth was undeniable. Then the state investigators entered. Detective Sarah Lucy approached the head table with an arrest warrant. Veronica Ashford, once commanding and confident, was handcuffed before the stunned audience. The sound of the cuffs clicking echoed like the final chord of a long, terrible symphony. "Veronica Ashford," Detective Lucy announced, "you are under arrest for bribery, embezzlement, and interference with federal investigations." The room was silent. The residents' anger softened into a mixture of relief and awe. Weeks of fear, confusion, and harassment had come to an abrupt, undeniable conclusion. Justice had arrived. With Veronica removed, our focus shifted to the families. We explained the resolution clearly and respectfully. Each household had the option to purchase their lot for $89,000, the original 1987 price, or enter a month-to-month lease agreement. Most residents chose to purchase, able to finance through existing mortgages, viewing it as a legal correction rather than a financial shock. Others, particularly elderly residents on fixed incomes, opted for the leases. Terms were generous, transparent, and fair. There were no surprises, no hidden penalties. The HOA was dissolved. In its place, the Willow Spring Residents Association was formed, focused on community well-being rather than enforcement of arbitrary rules. Property values, which everyone had feared would collapse, rose steadily as ownership issues were legally clarified. The neighborhood was no longer governed by false authority. Families began to return to normalcy, but this time with awareness. Sarah's memorial garden became a symbol of resilience and community, not just personal memory. Children played among the tomato rows, laughter echoing where fear and intimidation had once prevailed. Families began sharing harvests, exchanging knowledge about sustainable gardening and reconnecting with the land in ways that had been impossible under the shadow of harassment. Months later, Veronica Ashford was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Nancy, the clerk who had cooperated, received probation and community service. The investigation revealed similar schemes in 12 other states, all tied to the original Clearwater Development Network. The ripple effect of justice spread far beyond Willow Spring Estates. As I stood in the garden one evening, watching families work together, I realized the magnitude of what had happened. We had restored more than legal ownership. We had restored dignity, trust, and a sense of belonging. The lessons of loyalty, perseverance, and moral courage were no longer theoretical. They were tangible. They were alive in the people around me. The fight had been long, the obstacles formidable, and the stakes unimaginably high. But the truth had prevailed. And in that triumph, the community discovered something far more valuable than land or money. They discovered justice, integrity, and the enduring power of standing up for what is right. The weeks following the emergency HOA meeting were quieter than the storm that had just passed, but they were no less significant. Willow Spring Estates was still the same neighborhood, with its winding streets and familiar mailboxes, but the air had changed. Families no longer whispered behind closed doors or hesitated before planting a tree. They walked their lawns with confidence, knowing that the land beneath their feet was theirs, legitimately, lawfully, and with the weight of truth on their side. Sarah's memorial garden became the heart of this new reality. Where once it had been a private sanctuary, it now served as a communal gathering place. Children who had grown up under her care now brought their own, teaching them how to plant seeds, nurture growth, and respect the cycles of the earth. Every harvest reminded the community of what perseverance and dedication could achieve, even in the face of injustice. Residents who had once been skeptical or afraid now worked side by side, cultivating vegetables, flowers, and a sense of unity that had been absent for decades. Jessica decided to stay. She moved back from Portland, opening a small law practice focused on property rights and rural land disputes. Her office was in the old well house that Veronica had once cited as an unpermitted structure, now a designated historic preservation site. It felt symbolic. A building once accused of violating rules now became the center of legal knowledge and protection. She worked tirelessly, helping families understand their rights, avoid fraud, and safeguard the land they called home. Tom Bradley, the retired surveyor, began offering professional boundary verification services to local homeowners. Too often, he explained, elderly families were taken advantage of because they didn't understand legal intricacies or lacked documentation. He devoted his time to restoring clarity and peace of mind, showing that the lessons learned in Willow Spring Estates could prevent similar disasters elsewhere. Eleanor Patterson, now widely respected in genealogical and property research circles, donated the case files from our fight against Clearwater Development and Veronica Ashford to the State Historical Society. She spoke at conferences, demonstrating how ordinary citizens could combat corruption and fraud. Her meticulous documentation became a blueprint for uncovering hidden property violations and fraudulent land transfers. As for myself, I returned to tending Sarah's garden each morning. The act had once been a private ritual of grief and memory. Now it was a symbol of resilience, community, and justice. And I watched neighbors walk past, greeting one another with genuine warmth instead of cautious suspicion. Families who had once feared eviction now smiled as they passed the rows of tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. The garden was no longer just a memorial for Sarah. It was a living testament to everything she had taught us about care, patience, and integrity. The legal aftermath settled cleanly. Veronica Ashford faced federal sentencing and was removed permanently from positions of authority. Nancy, the county clerk who had cooperated with the investigation, received probation and community service. The HOA dissolved entirely, replaced by a simpler organization dedicated to fostering community rather than enforcing punitive rules. Property values stabilized and, in some cases, increased as clear legal titles restored confidence among homeowners and financial institutions alike. Perhaps the most meaningful outcome, however, was intangible. Trust, once broken by greed and corruption, slowly returned. Residents learned to value transparency, honesty, and accountability. They understood that ownership wasn't just about holding a deed, but about honoring commitments and respecting the history beneath their feet. Relationships were mended. Children learned lessons that couldn't be taught in a classroom, lessons about courage, resilience, and moral clarity. The Brewster Family Land Trust, which had started as a way to reclaim my grandfather's legacy, became something larger. It funded the Sarah Brewster Agricultural Scholarship at Purdue University, supporting students studying sustainable farming, environmental science, and agricultural law. The first recipient was Jake Morrison's granddaughter, a bright, determined young woman working on water conservation projects that would have made my hydrogeologist career look simple. Each year, the scholarship ensured that Sarah's passion for the land and community continued, shaping new generations. The neighborhood began hosting annual harvest festivals in the community center, once the site of confrontation and fear. Families brought dishes made from vegetables grown in their own yards. Children played between the garden rows, laughter echoing where intimidation had once thrived. The past remained, yes, the memory of deception, the fines, the threats, but it was now woven into a narrative of triumph rather than despair. Standing in Sarah's garden as the sun dipped low over the rooftops, I finally felt a sense of completion I had feared lost forever. Veronica had tried to erase the past, to intimidate, to claim authority where none existed. But in standing firm, in uncovering the truth, in demanding accountability, we built a future stronger than the pain that came before. The legacy of the Brewster family endured, not merely in land ownership, but in community, justice, and shared memory. Sometimes the best revenge isn't retaliation, it's restoration. It's creating something so enduring, so meaningful, that the past hardships are eclipsed by what has been built in their wake. That garden, that community, those children laughing in the rows of heirloom tomatoes, that was our triumph. That was justice served. That was Sarah's memory honored. And as I watered the garden one last time that evening, listening to the soft hum of life across the subdivision, I realized something profoundly simple, yet powerful. Integrity endures, truth prevails. And communities, when guided by honesty and care, can overcome even the deepest deception. The neighborhood had healed. The legacy had survived. And for the first time in years, I could breathe freely, knowing that standing up for what was right had changed not just my life, but the lives of every family in Willow Spring Estates.